The wind didn't make a sound the night Jacob Frost learned that some men are born with 1 foot in this world and 1 in the next. It was 1878, high in the Colorado Rockies, and the cabin where he sat alone had gone so quiet he could hear his own heartbeat echoing against the log walls. Outside, the pines stood like black towers against the sky, thick with stars, and somewhere in that darkness, something was waiting to speak. Jacob had been a cowboy once, back when his hands were steady and his mind was clear. He'd driven cattle up from Texas, slept under open skies, and known the simple rhythm of a life measured in miles and seasons. But that was before the accident at Copper Ridge, before the rockslide that buried 3 men and left Jacob trapped in the dark for 2 days with nothing but the sound of his own breathing and the voices that came when the silence grew too heavy to bear. They found him alive, which the doctor said was a miracle, but Jacob knew better. He'd made a bargain in that darkness, though he couldn't remember the words he'd spoken or the voice that had answered. All he knew was that when they pulled him from the rubble, something had followed him back into the light. The first time he heard them clearly was 3 weeks after the cave-in. He'd taken work at a ranch outside of Leadville, mending fences and trying to forget the weight of stone and the smell of earth closing in. He was alone in the north pasture when he heard a woman's voice, soft and clear as morning bells, telling him to move. He stepped sideways without thinking, and a rotted fence post collapsed exactly where he'd been standing, the rusted wire whipping through the air like a striking snake. Jacob stood there in the tall grass, his heart hammering, and looked around at the empty field. There was no one. There had never been anyone, but the voice had been as real as the sun on his face. He told no one. In those days, a man who heard voices was a man who'd lost his mind, and Jacob had seen what happened to such men. They ended up in asylums or alone in the wilderness, talking to trees and stones until the cold or the hunger took them. So he kept quiet and listened, and slowly he began to understand that the voices weren't madness at all. They were warnings. They were guidance. They were the whispers of something that existed just beyond the edge of what most men could see. The second time saved a child's life. Jacob had drifted south to a settlement called Birch Hollow, a collection of rough cabins, and a single trading post carved into the side of a valley. He'd been buying supplies when he heard again that same clear voice, urgent and insistent. He dropped the flour sack he'd been holding and ran outside, following something he couldn't name toward the creek that ran behind the settlement. A little girl, no more than 5 years old, had wandered too close to the water. The spring melt had turned the creek into a torrent, and she'd slipped on a muddy bank, going under in a flash of blue dress and dark water. Jacob didn't hesitate. He plunged in, the cold hitting him like a fist, and grabbed her just as the current tried to pull her downstream toward the rocks. He dragged her to shore, both of them coughing and shaking, and the girl's mother came running with tears streaming down her face. They called him a hero. They bought him drinks and offered him a bed and asked how he'd known to run to the creek at that exact moment. Jacob just smiled and said he'd heard a shout, though everyone knew the girl had gone under silent as a stone. That night, alone in the small room above the trading post, Jacob sat by the window and spoke to the darkness. "I don't know what you are," he said quietly, "but I'm listening. I'm listening." The air seemed to shift, like a breath drawn and held. And then, for the first time, he saw them. They weren't ghosts, not in the way the stories told it. They were more like shapes made of moonlight and shadow, impressions of people who had been but weren't anymore. An old woman in a bonnet, a young man in cavalry blues, a child no older than the girl he'd pulled from the creek. They stood at the edges of the room, watching him with eyes that held more sorrow than any living thing should carry. Jacob's first instinct was fear, but it passed quickly, replaced by something stranger. Recognition. He'd felt their presence in the cave-in, in the long hours of darkness when he'd thought he was dying. They'd been there then, and they were here now, and somehow he understood that they'd chosen him for a reason he couldn't yet name. "What do you want?" he asked. The old woman stepped closer, her form flickering like a candle flame. When she spoke, her voice was the one he'd been hearing, the one that had saved him and the child. "To be remembered," she said, "to finish what we left undone, to speak through a living voice." Jacob learned to live with them the way another man might learn to live with a constant companion. They didn't appear every day, but when they did, they brought knowledge that no living person could possess. They told him about the storm that would hit 3 days before it came. They showed him where a prospector had fallen into a hidden ravine, and Jacob led the search party straight to the spot. They warned him about a man in Leadville who smiled too wide, and whose hands were stained with another man's blood. Word spread, as word always does in the scattered settlements of the high country. People started calling him the spirit talker, though never to his face. Some said he was blessed. Others said he'd made a deal with the devil. Jacob didn't care much what they called him. He just kept moving, drifting from town to town, listening to the voices that no one else could hear. But there was a cost. There's always a cost for gifts like that. The spirits showed him things he didn't want to see. They showed him the moment of their deaths, over and over, like a nightmare played on an endless loop. The old woman had frozen to death in a cabin not 20 miles from where he sat, calling for her son who never came. The cavalry soldier had been shot in the back by his own officer over a dispute about stolen gold. The child had wandered into the woods and never found her way home. Their pain became his pain. Their unfinished business became his burden. And slowly, Jacob began to understand what they wanted from him. They wanted justice. They wanted peace. They wanted someone to carry their stories forward, so they wouldn't be forgotten in the vast silence of the mountains. The real test came in the winter of 1879, in a town called Redemption Ridge. Jacob had arrived in early November, just as the first snow began to fall. It was a mining town, rough and lawless, perched on the side of a mountain where men dug for silver and dreamed of fortunes they'd never see. He'd planned to stay only a few days, long enough to resupply before moving on. But the spirits had other plans. The night he arrived, they filled his room like a crowd at a hanging, more of them than he'd ever seen before, pressing close with urgent whispers that overlapped and tangled until he could barely think. "The mine," they said. "The mine. The mine." Jacob went to the largest saloon in town and asked careful questions. He learned that the Silver Bell mine employed 30 men and ran 2 shifts, day and night. He learned that the owner, a man named Thornton Creed, had pushed the crews hard all year, chasing a vein of ore that kept promising riches just a little deeper, just a little farther. He learned that in the past 5 years, 7 men had died in cave-ins and accidents at the Silver Bell. And standing in the corner of that saloon, visible only to Jacob, were those 7 dead men, watching him with hollow eyes. Jacob tried to ignore them. He learned that sometimes the spirits wanted things he couldn't give, and getting involved in the business of powerful men like Creed was a good way to end up at the bottom of a ravine. But the dead are patient, and they're persistent, and they knew exactly how to reach him. They showed him the future. It came in dreams that felt more real than waking. He saw the mine collapse, the timber splintering like kindling, the rock falling in a wave that crushed men like insects. He saw wives becoming widows and children becoming orphans. He saw the mountain swallowing 30 souls and Thornton Creed riding away with his pockets full of silver and his conscience clear. Jacob woke in a cold sweat, knowing what he had to do. He went to the mine the next morning and asked to speak with Creed. The foreman laughed in his face and told him to move along before he got hurt. But Jacob stood his ground, and eventually Creed himself came out, a big man in a fine coat with eyes like chips of ice. "I hear you're the one they call the spirit talker," Creed said, his voice thick with mockery. "Come to tell me my fortune?" I've come to tell you the mine's going to collapse, Jacob said quietly. Soon. Maybe days, maybe hours. You need to pull your men out and shore up the deep tunnel before you lose everyone. Creed stared at him for a long moment, then threw back his head and laughed. Boy, I've got engineers from Denver who say this mine is solid. I've got timbermen who've been doing this work since before you were born, and you're telling me to shut down my operation because you had a bad dream? It's not a dream, Jacob said. It's a warning. Get off my property, Creed said, and his voice had gone cold. And if I hear you've been spreading panic among my workers, I'll have you run out of this town on a rail. Jacob left, but he didn't leave Redemption Ridge. He went to the workers instead, catching them in small groups away from the mine, speaking in low, urgent tones about what he'd seen. Some listened. Most didn't. A man couldn't afford to believe in ghost stories when his family was hungry and the mine was the only work for 50 miles. But a few heard him. A few saw the truth in his eyes and the fear he couldn't hide. A foreman named Samuel Hart, who'd survived 2 cave-ins already and knew the sound of groaning timber in his sleep, gathered his courage and refused to take his crew down on the night shift. Creed fired him on the spot. But Sam Hart had gotten his men to walk off the job, and that meant 20 souls who weren't in the mine when it happened. The collapse came 3 days later, just after the afternoon shift had gone down. Jacob was in his room at the boarding house when he felt it, a tremor that ran through the earth like a shudder. He ran outside with half the town, and they all stood watching as dust rose from the mine entrance like smoke from a chimney. 10 men went down that day. The mine swallowed them whole. They dug for a week, but there was nothing to find. The mountain had claimed its due. Jacob stood at the edge of the pit with the spirits of the newly dead gathering around him like morning fog. They were confused, angry, afraid. They didn't understand yet that they were gone. He wanted to help them, wanted to speak the words that might give them peace, but his throat was too tight and his heart was too heavy. Sam Hart found him there as the sun was setting. You tried to warn them, Sam said. You saved my crew. You saved me. I didn't save enough, Jacob said. You saved who you could, Sam replied. That's more than most men do in a lifetime. Thornton Creed left town the next day, his pockets still full of silver, his hands still clean. There would be no justice for him, not in this world. But Jacob had learned by then that justice wasn't always for the living. The spirits followed Creed. Jacob didn't know exactly what they did. But 6 months later, he heard that Creed had died in Denver, fallen down a flight of stairs in his own mansion. Broken neck. Tragic accident. The kind of thing that happens sometimes, for no reason anyone can explain. Jacob stayed in Redemption Ridge through the winter. He helped the widows and the children, using what little money he had, and what he could earn doing odd jobs. The spirits were quieter now, their urgent whispers replaced by something that felt almost like gratitude. Spring came, and with it the thaw. Jacob stood at the edge of town with his bedroll on his back and his eyes on the distant peaks. The spirits had taught him many things in the years since the cave-in, but the most important was this. Some men are called to carry the weight of what others can't see. Some men are meant to stand between the living and the dead, to speak for those who have no voice, to remember those who would be forgotten. It was a hard gift. It was a lonely gift, but it was his. A woman's voice, soft and familiar, spoke beside him, the old woman who had frozen in her cabin, who had been the first to reach him in the darkness. "You've done well, Jacob Frost," she said. "You've done what we asked." "Will you stay?" he asked. "Will you always be here?" "Some of us," she said. "Some will move on, but there will always be others. There will always be voices that need to be heard." Jacob nodded. He'd expected as much. He walked out of Redemption Ridge as the morning sun touched the mountains, turning the snow to gold. Behind him, the spirits followed like a cloud of witness. Ahead of him, the frontier stretched wide and wild, full of towns that needed what he carried and people who needed what he could give. He was the cowboy who talked to spirits, and they answered, and he would keep listening, keep speaking, keep carrying their stories forward until the day came when he joined them in that space between the worlds. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of pine and distant rain. Jacob pulled his coat tighter and kept walking, one foot in front of the other, guided by voices only he could hear. And in the vast silence of mountains, the dead walked with him, grateful that someone still remembered their names.